Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. So we continue to watch and observe for any signs of a possible Ukrainian counterattack. We have seen signs recently over the past few days, 48 hours or so, that the Ukrainians may be reassessing its ability to launch a counteroffensive, especially in the region of Zaporizhia, south of Zaporizhia, within the vicinity south of Orikhiv. So over the past 48 hours, it appears that Ukrainian forces attempted a multi-battalion reconnaissance in force south of Orikhiv towards Russian positions along the line of contact. It looks like the Ukrainians are very much focused on the town of Tokmak in this area. And any future-facing Ukrainian offensive operation could be designed, at least the initial stages, to seize control of this town to the northeast of the main goal, which would be Melitopol. Now, what appeared to have occurred just south of Orikhiv was about 1 to 2 battalion tactical groups of Ukrainian forces that were being supported by artillery, HIMARS, other Western systems. These forces, again, attempted a reconnaissance in force along this contact line just to the south of Orikhiv. This combat group met incredibly stiff resistance, losing a number of armored fighting vehicles, tanks, and the Russians caused some casualties to the Ukrainian combat grouping that was launched in this area. And given the level of resistance that the Ukrainians observed, they could be rethinking operations, especially south of Zaporizhia, south of Orikhiv. The Ukrainians were this Ukrainian battalion combat group, 1, possibly 2 battalions, came under heavy artillery attack. It also came under direct attack with air-to-ground ordnance, Su-25s, Su-34s, glide bombs were used, very large glide bombs, 3,000-pound plus glide bombs were used against these formations, these Ukrainian formations south of Orikhiv. And again, and given the level of firepower and resistance that those battalion tactical groups, the amount of firepower that they observed, and the amount of losses that they took, it appears the Ukrainians are reassessing operations in this area. If they were to launch larger multi-brigade operations, the amount of casualties that the Ukrainians could take could be incredibly high. And again, we've talked about this before. If you're going to launch a large-scale modern offensive with armored fighting vehicles against an enemy who essentially has air superiority, limited air superiority, the Russians, while not always overflying Ukrainian territory, again, we are seeing the Russians launch these glide bombs and standoff weapon systems from areas that they control, but nonetheless, these have been effective attacks against Ukrainian targets. But as the Ukrainians press south into Russian-controlled territory where they don't have that air defense envelope necessarily set up, that's where the Ukrainians are running into problems. And one side that is not wanting the Ukrainians to launch this attack. You have one group of military advisors in the West. You have Ukrainian personnel as well that appears to be saying, look, let's hit the brakes here. If we launch this offensive with 6 to 12 of these newly formed brigades, we are at great risk of sustaining massive amounts of casualties. And the loss of those formed brigades, as newly formed brigades, many of them equipped with Western equipment, Western armored fighting vehicles, would be a detriment to continue the war. Then on the other hand, you have a group, including the politicians in Kiev, that are advocating some sort of massive counteroffensive that may not be effective. And I think what's happening is they're looking at, the politicians in Kiev that are trying to get this offensive operation pushed forward by the Ukrainians, are looking at what happened in Kherson. They're looking at what happened in Kharkov up here to the northeast. And they think that they believe that based on prior success, that they would see another successful operation take place to the north of Melitopol, to the south of Zaporizhia. Now, there's a problem with that. The disposition of Russian forces are quite a bit different than what the disposition of Russian forces were when they took control of Kherson, when they took control of Kharkov, to areas east of Kharkov and southeast of Kharkov. You got to remember, the Russians redeployed a large number of forces that were on the western bank of the Dnieper River, including some very good combat units that were deployed on the western bank of the Dnieper River. We saw about 20 to 25,000 Russian forces withdraw from this western bank of the Dnieper River and redeploy about 10,000 of those forces south of Zaporizhia along this line of contact. So the dynamics have changed. Again, we're seeing multiple lines of Russian defensive lines north of Tokmak. And again, the terrain. The terrain is very, very, very important in this fight, or in this prospective fight. Again, if you look at the terrain, and this does an okay job, it is very wide open with very little foliage. I mean, this area is indicative, if you've ever been to Kansas or parts of Nebraska, this is what this area looks like. Very wide open spaces with that gives the Russian forces that are on the defensive the ability to very easily attack these large columns of Ukrainian forces that would be running down these main roadways and open fields, many of which have been mined. Massive amounts of mines are being used by the Russians. And then again, the principal problem for the Ukrainians is the ability of the Russian Air Force to be called up and used against those formations trying to press south. We've seen it in this area. We've seen it on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, in which we've seen the Ukrainians attempt to conduct limited landings on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. Again, they're feeling out Russian defensive capability. And when they do that, when we saw these Ukrainian forces land on this eastern bank of the Dnieper River here, we saw them immediately come under withering artillery attack and again attack with fixed-wing aircraft as well, and helicopter gunships. So again, the same thing is going to happen up here in the north, within the vicinity south of Orikhiv. So very, very concerning situation for the Ukrainians. And again, there appears to be this back and forth. One side wants to go, the other side is saying, "Look, pause. We're not sure this is going to end well. This is going to put us in a very, very difficult situation." Obviously, you have the political leadership in Kiev, Zelensky, his inner circle, pushing for this offensive. And then you have combatant commanders on the ground. These are Ukrainian battalion commanders, company commanders saying, "Whoa, wait a minute. Stop. This is a different paradigm. This is a different battle than what we faced in Kherson. This is a different battle than what we faced in the area east of Orikhiv. Remember, Orikhiv, you were seeing areas where there was more foliage. The Ukrainians were in a better position than some of these Russian units. We know the morale of some of these Russian units were not the highest when the Ukrainians launched this offensive east of Kharkov. That's not what is happening south of Zaporizhia. Different units, different capabilities that the Ukrainians are going to run into. Again, past performance does not is not indicative of what is going to happen in the future, especially when you compare and contrast what happened near Kharkov to what could happen south of Zaporizhia within the area near Orikhiv. So that's kind of where we sit right now. We've also, over the last 24 hours, 48 hours, have seen about 60 Russian sorties, including the use of heavy aviation, backfire bombers, blackjack bombers being used to attack Ukrainian positions. Most of those were using standoff cruise missiles. We saw a massive wave of Russian kamikaze drones being used against Ukrainian targets. We believe the Russians were relatively successful. I mean, if you listen to Ukrainian reports, they claim they shot down every single kamikaze drone, and very little was done by this Russian uptick in air attacks against Ukrainian forces. But we don't believe that that's the case. We believe the Russians were relatively successful in some of these missions in striking command and control nodes, and more importantly, supply depots and staging areas for this prospective offensive by the Ukrainian army. So that's kind of where we sit right now. We will continue to observe. We will continue to report. Thank you for joining us today. We will continue to bring you daily updates. Appreciate everyone joining us. And as always, have a good day.